The strange but true story featured on this podcast contains details some people may find distressing. Listener discretion is advised. I'm Chayaz Samuel, and things are about to get weird. Hello everyone, thank you for joining me today for a brand new episode of Things Are About to Get Weird. I hope you're all doing okay and are having a good week, and are as happy as I am that we're now into February and edging that bit closer to springtime. And now, after this rather chipper intro, it's time to get a little darker, because the story that I have to tell you today is definitely on the more harrowing side of things. This is the strange but true tale of the Stanford prison experiment, and it's something I've been meaning to cover ever since I heard about it. Although this one is at times disturbing, it's also fascinating for a whole host of reasons, and there is a lot of information to get through, so without further delay, let's get started. Stanford University, located in the US state of California, is widely considered to be one of the top private learning institutions in the world. Notable former students include the likes of the 31st President of the United States, Herbert Hoover, ex-British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, and the founders of huge companies including Netflix, LinkedIn, tech multinational Alphabet Inc., and even Nike. It's safe to say that it's an incredibly well-respected and highly regarded school, but back in 1971, an incident occurred at Stanford that would send shockwaves through the world of psychology and become far bigger than those involved in it could ever have anticipated. I'm going to begin today by introducing you to one of the key figures in this story, then Professor of Psychology at Stanford University, Dr. Philip G Zimbardo. Dr. Zimbardo was an internationally renowned and recognized psychologist, and when he passed away last year in October of 2024, many of the articles paying tribute to him featured quotes from fellow academics which were full of praise. Claude Steele, also a Stanford psychology professor, was quoted by Sky News as saying that the doctor was one of the most prolific and influential psychologists of his generation, a true pioneer in the field of social psychology, and websites dedicated to areas of his work released heartfelt updates about the news of his death. But whilst he was beloved by some, Dr. Zimbardo was viewed by others as a controversial figure, and to understand why, we must head back to August of 1971. The doctor had had an idea, arguably an idea that, under different circumstances, could have been pretty revolutionary. In preparation of bringing this idea to life, he had placed an advert in the local press which read as follows: "Male college students needed for psychological study of prison life, $15 per day for 1 to 2 weeks, beginning August 14th. For further information and applications, come to room 248, Jordan Hall, Stanford University." The advert was small and somewhat inconspicuous, but for some of those whose responses to it were successful, they could never have imagined how huge of an impact it would end up leaving on them. Out of the approximately 70 people who applied, Dr. Zimbardo, along with his team, ended up choosing 24 young men to take part in this experiment. Most of them would be active participants, whilst a few would be kept back as stand-ins. The idea was relatively simple on paper. The participants were to be divided up at random, literally by the flip of a coin, and given the role of either inmate or prison guard. They would then be placed into a simulated prison environment for 2 weeks, which was to be set up in the basement of Stanford's Jordan Hall, and was to be funded by the US Office of Naval Research. Whilst the US Marines and the Navy were keen to gather learnings about conflicts between military guards and prisoners, Dr. Zimbardo wanted to, quote, "examine the psychological effects of authority and powerlessness in a prison environment, whilst also gaining deeper insight insights into how role-playing or being given a certain label can affect a person's behaviour. Now, the 24 men who were picked to take part had been carefully screened. They were asked about their mental and physical health histories, their family backgrounds, and assessed in terms of their social behaviour, and all of them were deemed to be what was described as normal, quote-unquote, and were therefore considered suitable for the experiment. As I say, coins were flipped which determined who would be the prisoners and who would be the guards, and on the morning of the 17th of August, the study kicked off in quite spectacular style. On this quiet Sunday morning, those who had been assigned the role of prisoner were about to have a shocking wake-up call. Real police officers from the city of Palo Alto were roped in by Dr. Zimbardo to stage surprise mock arrests of the students from their homes. They were told by the officers that they were being detained on suspicion of armed robbery and were given the full treatment. They were read their rights, handcuffed, frisked, and then taken to the local police station. When they arrived, the experiment continued. They were fingerprinted, formally informed of their charges, blindfolded, and put in a holding cell before being told that they were about to be transported to prison, and the prison was certainly ready for them. Dr. Zimbardo and his team of researchers had considered every detail when it came to making the prison environment as realistic as they possibly could. They'd created cells complete with bars on the doors, a special isolation cell they named the Hole, which contained a circular drain in the floor for any prisoner who found himself locked in there to use as a toilet. Incredibly basic beds and facilities plus a uniform, which consisted of a white dress-like garment. They had designed the fake prison with the help of some real former inmates, who helped them to make sure it felt as genuine as possible. Plus, in order for Dr. Zimbardo and his team to observe everything that took place in the prison for the purposes of study and analysis, hidden cameras and audio equipment were installed, so they could keep their eyes and ears across every interaction. Once the guards were in place, all they needed now were the prisoners. As soon as they began to arrive at the makeshift prison, probably a bit shaken up from the ordeal of being arrested, they were truly thrown into the experience of being an inmate. They were strip searched, went through a fake delousing ritual, and handed their uniform, which included the aforementioned white dress complete with an ID number, plus a cap and rubber sandals. Speaking about the white dress shortly after the experiment, Dr. Zimbardo said, "Real male prisoners don't wear dresses, but real male prisoners, we have learned, do feel humiliated, do feel emasculated, and we thought we could produce the same effects very quickly by putting men in a dress without any underclothes. But that wasn't all. Each prisoner was also made to wear a chain which was secured around his ankle and was meant to act as a reminder to the inmates that if their situation was real, they would not be able to leave and that they would no longer be free." Now, the prisoners weren't the only ones who had to wear uniforms. Those who were assigned the role of a guard were given a khaki-coloured outfit, a baton and a whistle to carry, and interestingly were asked to wear mirrored sunglasses. This was in order to make sure that it wasn't possible for the prisoners to make eye contact with them, which I can imagine would have immediately fostered this sense of detachment between the people acting out the different roles. Some reports about the Stanford prison experiment tend to make out that the prisoners and guards were simply thrown into the basement and left to their own devices. But this isn't strictly true. Dr. Zimbardo himself was actually involved in the experiment, taking on the role of prison superintendent, whilst the person playing the warden was also one of his team members. Although those running the study didn't plan to interfere too much, they did instruct the guards ahead of time that they were not allowed to physically abuse the prisoners. But of course, the overall point was to see how both sides would behave under the circumstances which had been created. And so the experiment began. From the very beginning, the idea that the prisoners were meant to feel de-individualized was evident. They were called by their ID numbers rather than their names, and they were only allowed to refer to each other by their numbers too. As for the guards, although they'd been told that physical violence was out of the question, they were allowed to do what they saw fit in the name of law and order. Before I go any further, just remember this point. The guards were just normal students. They could have just as easily been made a prisoner in the study. They hadn't specifically chosen or been chosen to be guards because they were deemed stronger or more authoritative. They were just university-aged regular men who had been given a role to play. Just keep that in mind. So, within just hours of the start of the experiment, things started to get a little edgy. At around 2:30 a.m. on the very first night, the prisoners were awoken by the guards blowing their whistles and forcing them to get out of bed, making them line up facing a wall with their hands up. The guards demanded that the prisoners memorize and repeat their ID numbers and made them do push-ups as a punishment if they got it wrong, and the prisoners complied. On that first night at least. In fact, as easily and quickly as those playing the guards seemed to have slipped into character, so did those playing the prisoners. While some became submissive and accepted that whilst they were locked up, they were doomed to be dehumanized by the guards, others began to react strongly to the way they were being treated. From the very beginning, there were signs that things were not destined to go smoothly with the experiment, and these signs didn't lie. By just day 2 of the fortnight-long study, chaos officially broke out. Despite the experiment still being in its opening stages, the prisoners had quickly grown angry at the way they were being treated, tiring of the verbal insults and punishments of physical activity much sooner than the guards had anticipated. In the early hours of the morning on day 2, the prisoners decided to stage a rebellion, barricading themselves in their cells, tearing their ID numbers off their uniforms, and removing the caps they were made to wear, which were initially made part of the uniform as a replacement for shaving the inmates' heads upon entering the prison. Whilst this rebellion was surprising to the researchers, what happened next was nothing short of shocking. The guards who were on duty decided to respond to the prisoners' actions with alarming force. Grabbing fire extinguishers, they began to spray the powerful jets at the cells, forcing the prisoners to move away so that they could break down the barricades. Once the guards were able to gain entry to each cell, they seized the prisoners before stripping them naked and confiscating their mattresses. Before long, they had worked out who the instigators of the rebellion were, and they were thrown into the makeshift solitary confinement areas. So picture the scene for a moment. Imagine you were one of the prisoners standing naked in a nearly empty cell, deprived of sleep for a second night. I would imagine that once the adrenaline of the protest had worn off, you'd be left feeling fairly exhausted and quite vulnerable too. And if you were one of the guards, who, remember, were really just university students, would you perhaps look at your fellow participants in this situation and feel that maybe it had all gone far enough? I think most of us would like to think that we'd be the ones being the voice of reason, telling our fellow guards that we should probably try to calm things down and de-escalate the unrest. After all, they did have free will in terms of how they acted next. But that's not exactly what happened. In fact, as uncomfortable as things had already become for the prisoners, in reality, their ordeal had only just begun. The guards decided to shift their focus. Forcing the prisoners to do push-ups and destroying their barricades with fire extinguishers was one thing, but knowing they couldn't push the physical side of things too much further, They instead set their sights on what has since been described as psychological warfare. Now, the group of prisoners had already demonstrated somewhat of a united front, which was evident in the staging of the rebellion, and the guards did not like this. Following their quashing of the protest, the guards settled on a way to break this bond between the prisoners by setting up what they called a privilege cell. This was a space where those who showed they were willing to cooperate with the guards and behave in the ways they expected were shown special treatment, which in this case meant that they were given back their clothing and bedding, and allowed access to basic hygiene items like a toothbrush and the facilities for washing themselves. But for those outside of the privilege cell, it was only getting worse. Not content with the humiliation they'd already put the prisoners through, the guards would make them perform cruel rituals just because they could. At 10 p.m. at night, they would take them on a final toilet run, placing paper bags over their heads and making them march with their chained ankles to the toilet facilities to use them one last time before lights out. During the night, their only option would be to use a bucket in their cell instead, and if they did so, the guards would often not allow them to empty the open bedpan come morning. When it came to food, the guards saw this as another opportunity to cause a divide. The prisoners in the privileged cell were given special meals, whilst those outside of it were made to watch them eat, having had their food supply temporarily stopped. As well as being a punishment, this was also a way of causing a clear rift between the prisoners. But it wasn't entirely plain sailing for those in the privileged cell either. The guards took to occasionally placing a more rebellious prisoner amongst the privileged ones in order to upset the balance and cause further trust issues and confusion within the group. Bear in mind that by this point we're only at day 3, and it turns out that this day was set to be a pivotal point within the experiment. As the time had gone on, a clear pattern seemed to have emerged. The more controlling and at times brutal the guards grew, the more submissive the prisoners became. For some people it could have been the other way round, of course. Which of these came first, it's difficult to say, but the results were quite stark. And just 36 hours into the study, the conditions started to take a real toll on one of those taking part. Prisoner 8612, a young man named Doug Corpy. He began to suffer from what was described as acute emotional disturbance, disorganized thinking, uncontrollable crying, and rage. At first, the guards suspected that he was putting on an act in an attempt to be let out of the experiment early, and tried to win him over by offering him a role as an informant in exchange for better treatment. But when they came to the realization that Doug was genuinely in distress, and after he frantically started telling the other prisoners that they weren't allowed to leave and weren't permitted to quit the study, which, although it wasn't true, really started to rattle them, the researchers knew that they had to step in. Doug was the first person to be released from the fake prison, and much was written about this incident after the fact. In recent years, Doug, who actually later became a prison psychologist himself, has spoken about how, although his breakdown wasn't completely authentic, in the sense that he remembers deciding to act in a certain way in order to be let out, he did so because he genuinely began to believe that he was not allowed to quit and that he was being imprisoned for real, so his emotions were authentic. Doug's release had an unexpected effect on the remaining prisoners. The next day, Dr. Zimbardo arranged a visiting hour for them, where their friends and family could come and see what they were involved with. Before this took place, considerable efforts were made to make the environment and the prisoners themselves seem much more cared for than they really were. The makeshift prison was cleaned and tidied, and the inmates were allowed to wash and shave before being given a hearty meal. Music was even played over the intercom system to make the place seem more inviting, but this did very little to fool some of the parents of the prisoners in particular. They could instantly tell that their sons were troubled and exhausted, and some even complained to the research team about their concerns. But for the prisoners, the remarks of worry from their families were not at the forefront of their minds for long. Something else was brewing. During the visit, one of the guards overheard the prisoners talking about a rumour that prisoner 8612, Doug Corpy, was planning to gather a group of his friends together on the outside to help orchestrate a mass breakout, freeing his fellow prisoners from the experiment. And what happened here was fascinating. Instead of the researchers seeing this as a psychologically noteworthy turn of events within the context of the study, they instead became far more concerned about the security aspect. Dr. Zimbardo actually inquired as to whether they could have the prisoners transferred to a real former prison in order to thwart any attempted break-ins or breakouts, but he was unsuccessful in doing so. Instead, the prisoners were blindfolded and taken to a different floor of the building, whilst Dr. Zimbardo himself sat up all night in anticipation of the prison break, but it never actually came. At a later date, Dr. Zimbardo would actually look back on this and admit that he was probably too far into the experiment himself, and that he was thinking like a prison superintendent rather than a research psychologist, which is a very good point. It's quite shocking to think that, as blurred as the lines had become for the people involved in the experiment, the prisoners and the guards, the same thing seemed to be happening to the researchers too. Anyway, the realization that the rumour hadn't had any substance to it seemed to infuriate the guards, and the level of harassment they proceeded to subject the prisoners to was definitely heightened. They brought back the push-ups as a punishment and added jumping jacks into the mix too, but this time they would drag out the counts where these were forced upon the prisoners to hours at a time. They also made the inmates do tasks like cleaning the toilet bowls with their bare hands. Around this time, Dr. Zimbardo had arranged for a Catholic prison chaplain to pay them a visit and speak to each prisoner individually. The purpose of this was actually for the priest to inform the researchers as to how realistic he thought the experiment was, based on his knowledge of real prisons. But the visit didn't go entirely to plan. In another huge blurring of the lines between reality and the study, the priest ended up telling the inmates that their only hope of getting out was to speak with a lawyer. In actual fact, he was probably just playing his role within the experiment a little too well. But for the emotionally fragile prisoners, many of whom had instinctively introduced themselves to the priest using their ID number rather than their name, this was likely difficult and confusing to hear. One inmate who refused to speak with the priest at all was prisoner 819. On the day of the chaplain's visit, he had a breakdown and began to sob uncontrollably, asking to instead speak to a doctor. By this point, another prisoner, as well as Doug Corpy, had already been released, and the researchers were worried they were about to have a third participant quit. Although he was incredibly distressed, when prisoner 819 was taken by the researchers to get some food and see a doctor, the remaining prisoners were lined up by the guards and forced to chant a taunting message to their comrade, repeating the statement, "Prisoner 819 is a bad prisoner. Because of what prisoner 819 did, my cell is a mess, Mr. Correctional Officer," over a dozen times. Prisoner 819 actually managed to hear the chanting, and when he did, he became hysterically upset, asking to return to the cells to prove that he was not, in fact, a bad prisoner. Here's what Dr. Zimbardo said whilst recalling this moment, quote, "At that point, I said, 'Listen, you are not 819. You are name, and my name is Dr. Zimbardo. I am a psychologist, not a prison superintendent, and this is not a real prison. This is just an experiment, and those are students, not prisoners, just like you. Let's go." He stopped crying suddenly, looked up at me like a small child awakened from a nightmare, and replied, "Okay, let's go." This was quite chilling to read, I must say. After the priest's visit, the next thing the researchers organised was a mock parole hearing, in which all of those who believed they may have grounds for parole were chained together and taken before a parole board, one by one. Dr. Zimbardo also later recalled this moment in the study, saying, "Several remarkable things occurred during these parole hearings. First, when we asked prisoners whether they would forfeit the money they had earned up to that time if we were to parole them, most said yes. Then, when we ended the hearings by telling prisoners to go back to their cells while we considered their requests, every prisoner obeyed, even though they could have obtained the same result by simply quitting the experiment. Why did they obey? Because they felt powerless to resist. Their sense of reality had shifted. They no longer perceived their imprisonment as an experiment. In the psychological prison we had created, only the correctional staff had the power to grant paroles. By the 5th night and into the 6th day of the experiment, Dr. Zimbardo came to a sobering realization, following calls from parents of the students taking part, where they told him they were consulting lawyers to try and free their sons from the fake prison, plus an increase in the number of emotional breakdowns by prisoners and troubling behavior from the guards. The researchers were becoming concerned about the integrity of their own study. They had found out that the guards were being abusive to the prisoners even when they weren't watching, when they weren't being observed, and their actions were becoming ever more aggressive. The final straw appeared to be a visit to the prison from Christina Maslach, who had recently gained her PhD from Stanford, and who was incredibly concerned about what she observed. It was at this point that Dr. Zimbardo knew the experiment had to end early, and that there was no possible way they could make it to the 2-week mark. Following the termination of the study, the doctor said, "We had created an overwhelmingly powerful situation, a situation in which prisoners were withdrawing and behaving in pathological ways, and in which some of the guards were behaving sadistically. Even the good guards felt helpless to intervene, and none of the guards quit whilst the study was in progress. Indeed, it should be noted that no guard ever came late for his shift, called in sick, left early, or demanded extra pay for overtime work." As you can imagine, in the years since the Stanford prison experiment, a huge amount of analysis of it has taken place, and we can kind of split this into two camps: the criticisms of the ethics of the study, and then on the other side of things, what was still learned from it. So let's take the criticisms first. Outside of the obvious factors, like the researchers becoming too involved, the lack of safeguarding of the participants, and keeping people in the study after they clearly expressed a wish to leave, one prominent criticism involved the wording of that initial advert placed in the newspaper. Some psychologists claim that by asking the group of participants to self-select themselves for something described as a psychological study of prison life, that the researchers had set themselves up to attract volunteers who were more authoritarian, more aggressive, more socially dominant. Another huge criticism was that the findings weren't entirely reliable, as many of those who had taken part, the guards especially, were simply playing roles that at times got out of hand. They began by behaving as they thought they should, something known as demand characteristics. Some of the guards have even spoken about this. One, Dave Eshelman, said that he consciously created his guard persona, explaining, quote, "I was in all kinds of drama productions in high school and college. It was something I was very familiar with. To take on another personality before you step out on the stage. I was kind of running my own experiment in there by saying, how far can I push these things and how much abuse will these people take before they say, knock it off?" Honestly, I could go on and on about the negatives, but I think to a certain extent the details speak for themselves. I think if any of us knew that someone we loved was in the position of one of the prisoners in an experiment like this and were being treated the way that they were at Stanford, we would also be horrified. But before we finish, let's briefly touch on some of the learnings. Ultimately, the Stanford prison experiment is still discussed in psychological learning settings to this day. An article I read from Newsweek summed up the findings really well, saying, "The takeaway from Zimbardo's Stanford prison experiment: evil environments in which those in power can do whatever they want to the powerless without fear of reprisal, like prison, can corrupt even normal, educated, healthy people. The test, called the Stanford prison experiment, remains a staple of psychology coursework and training for the armed forces." From all I've read, it's clear that as awful as the experiment was, the outcomes were fascinating from a scientific standpoint. And if you want to get deeper into the more academic analyses of the psychology of this story, I'd highly recommend checking out some of the articles I'll mention in our outro. But there were some positive outcomes too. For example, the way the participants were treated led to formal ethical guidelines being established by the American Psychological Association. This was to ensure that studies involving real people are properly reviewed before they can take place. Plus, it also had an impact on some areas of prison policy in the US too, most notably that juvenile prisoners accused of federal crimes were no longer locked up with adult prisoners prior to their trial dates. Though it's important to point out that plenty of other, more negative prison policies that have come into place since the study appear to have learned nothing from the Stanford prison experiment, so its impact probably shouldn't be overstated in this area. At the end of my research into this story, all I could really think about were the participants, and my hope that they were able to recover from their parts in the study. I have no doubts that some of them would have been truly traumatized, and I wouldn't be surprised if others carried guilt afterwards too. In my opinion, I think it's clear why the experiment makes us feel uncomfortable. We try to imagine how we would fare in the participants' shoes, and as strong as our convictions are in theory, it's hard to deny that the question marks raised by the study still cast a haunting shadow. Well, there is still so much more I could say about this story. I think it could be a multi-part series, to be honest, but I really hope you found this overview interesting and thought-provoking. What do you make of the study? Is it something you could have seen yourself volunteering for had you been a Stanford student at the time? This one is definitely going to stick in my mind for a good while. I can already feel it. I will be shouting out all of the sources for today's story shortly, but first it's that time once again to kick off our outro. Here is the beloved feature I like to call Weird Media. I am so excited about today's Weird Media recommendation. Firstly, because it's a podcast shout out, which I always love to do. And secondly, because it's something that's been created by one of my very favourite podcasters of all time, the one and only Rachel Fairburn. A few weeks ago, I spotted a post from Rachel on social media announcing that she had launched a brand new show called Harpervale. It's a comedy fiction podcast, which makes sense as Rachel is a professional comedian and an incredibly funny one at that, and I was immediately just dying to listen. Now, in a way, this is an unusual recommendation because at the time of me recording, only 2 episodes have been released, but based on those alone, I'm already hooked. Harpervale is a series of short stories Rachel has written about residents of what she describes as the spine-tingling suburb where nothing is quite as it seems. The first 2 episodes are standalone tales, and I kind of got Inside Number 9 vibes from both of them. The first, Spectrophilia, has a ghostly supernatural theme, whereas the second, Rhonda Kinsella, is darker and quite chilling. I actually think this might be the first pure fiction podcast that I've ever listened to, where it's the straight narration of the story, and I absolutely love the format. The first episode is 15 minutes long, and the second is 7 minutes, but Rachel manages to take you on an entire journey no matter the length. And I love how she's written the episodes. If you're familiar with her work, you'll already know that the narration is going to be brilliant, and I'm genuinely buzzing for the next episode to drop. There are some disturbing themes within the podcast, particularly the second one, so do be aware of that before listening. But if you do check out Harper Vale, I hope you love it as much as I do. Okay, time now for our source shoutouts. We had that Newsweek article about the experiment. That was by Victoria Bekiempis from August 2015. A super detailed breakdown from simplypsychology.org by Saul McLeod, PhD, from November 2023. A New Yorker article by Maria Konnikova from June 2015. A Sky News piece about Dr. Zimbardo's death. That was published in October 2024. The Stanford Prison Experiment website, prisonexp.org, was incredibly helpful. There was a great CBS News article from December 2011. The Stanford University archives, which contain a number of photographs taken during the study. And finally, a piece on the Britannica website from December 2024. As I say, I would love to know what you think of this story, so here's a reminder of all of the ways you can get in touch. On Instagram and Threads, just look up at Things Get Weird Podcast. On TikTok, we are at Things Are About to Get Weird. And on Facebook, you can find us by searching for Things Are About to Get Weird. Over there, you'll find our main page and our private discussion group. Our email address is thingsgetweirdpodcast@gmail.com. And if you've enjoyed this episode, I would massively appreciate a quick rating or review wherever you're listening. And if that place is Spotify, please feel free to leave a comment on the episode page. Thank you all once again for joining me and for your continued support. And I'll be back with a brand new strange but true tale to tell you very soon. So until next time, take care of yourself and others and keep it weird, but the good kind of weird.